Welcome back. Really nice to see people introducing themselves here in chat. We're a big community at RTRS. There's 220 people in this room now. So feel free to reach out to new and old friends through chat, and we will have some interaction later on today. Let me just introduce myself. My name's James Allen. I'm director at OLAB and the moderator of today's meeting point. And very briefly, let me present today's agenda. So as you will see in the next slide, we have 3 panels on China, environmental footprinting, and on European legislation. And we have organized an interlude and networking opportunities in between these panels. So do come with your networking hats on and a willingness to engage with colleagues. Some quick housekeeping reminders once again. The next panel will be in Chinese. So if you need translation, I know many of us will do, please do click on the interpretation ball at the bottom of the page. Choose your language preference and stay in that channel throughout. While we listen to the China panel, we will be able to put questions to our panelists using Slido. We'll post a link here in chat, so you can click on the link to Slido and post those messages. Do rename yourself in Zoom if you haven't done so yet. Make sure that your name and your organization are clear in Zoom by clicking over those 3 dots where your image is and using the option rename. And finally, we're just going to be managing time today using a couple of sounds. So each of our panelists has been given 4 minutes in the first panel and then 3 minutes in the next one. When that time is up, you will hear a small bell sound, which sounds like this, hopefully. Thank you. And just a reminder for people to stay on mute, please. And when the session itself comes to an end, we've got a gong for you to symbol the end of the session. So the gong should sound like this at the end of the panel. Fantastic. So I think that's a really nice start for our very first panel, and that's the role of China in a responsible world. Allow me to introduce Isabel Nepstad, Chief Officer and Founder at Bellatera Consulting. And Isabel will introduce our panelists. Over to you, Isabel.
Great, thank you very much. And yeah, I would like to say hello and greetings to everyone from China. My name is Isabel Nepstad, and I'm based here in China, also as the external consultant for RTRS. I will be speaking in Chinese for our China panel discussion, so please use the interpretation function just explained. So I'll be switching over to Chinese now to introduce the China panel. 大家晚上好，很荣幸有这个机会跟老朋友们，还有新朋友们，还有我们大豆供应链的专家和嘉宾，晚上好。今天很荣幸有这个机会跟大家交流，特别是这个中国在全球的供应链中的角色。我们今天讨论的目标是探索中国在负责任采购与生产标准方面中国是为了什么样的转变角色，同时我们也会考虑什么样的政策能够支持行业倡议转变大豆供应链的可持续发展。很荣幸可以介绍我们的今天嘉宾的专家。第一个很荣幸介绍来自中国社会经济系统分析研究会副理事长张振平教授。也很荣幸介绍来自中国生态环境部对外合作与交流中心高级工程师赵阳先生，有来自中国大豆产业协会原会长刘登高，还有来自 CDP 全球环境信息研究中心中国办公室方立芳，欢迎大家。大家都在现场吗？
都在。
在。
好，没有，好的，好，那我们就开始。今天很荣幸就是有这个机会跟大家交流，然后因为最近中国也一直在不断的改变，特别是重视一些比较重要的环境方面的领域，包括 气候变化和生物多样性。我自己不会说太多，但是我们都知道中国在全球的大豆供应链的重要性是非常大家都比较关注。所以我第一个问题是问张建平教授。就是第一个问题，在全球的负责任大豆供应链，中国有什么样的可能性的领导角色？有请张建平教授。
好，谢谢伊莎贝尔。转眼之间，我跟伊莎贝尔，我记得是在18年我们开始讨论这个可持续大豆的话题。最近这些年呢，我们都持续的在进行对话。那应该说，现在在全球致力于实现2030年可持续发展目标的这个进程当中，那么我们这个大豆的领域，也需要开展自己相关的工作。目前在全球绿色价值链构建，还有呢就是防止气候变化的进程当中，那么大豆这种软商品是得到了这个全球高度的关注。那在这个全球的绿色价值链当中，中国当然是一个很重要的一个消费者，也是一个全球很大的这个进口商进口国家。但是在这里呢，我也提醒大家，就是其实中国拥有庞大的人口。那么就是我们在讨论和分析这种问题的过程当中，也不能光看总量也一定要看这个人均的消费水平和市场的需求。这一点呢，在最近这几年，我们和国内外的农林专家讨论这个话题的过程当中，大家都非常重视这个问题。我理解呢，它也特别像这个就是气候变化的谈判。就是你比如说你谈论这个二氧化碳的排放，那我们肯定呢都要考虑说发达国家历史上排放的总量是多少，发达国家的人均排放是多少，还有就是中国现在呢作为一个发展中国家，我们的人均排放量和排放的总量都需要去考虑，是一个道理。今天我的发言呢，实际上呢是我用的这个中国社会经济系统分析研究会这个头衔。大家都知道“14·5”规划，中国的第14个5年规划，我们其中非常重要的一个原则，就是要坚持系统思维的原则。所以呢，我也把这个系统论我觉得是非常值得去运用在我们大豆的绿色全球价值链的这个分析和讨论当中，因为在这个系统当中无论是我们的生产者，还是我们的贸易商，也包括跨国公司以及呢中国作为一个消费市场那么其实每一个利益相关方都在其中发挥着非常重要的角色和作用。所以从这个角度来讲呢，我也希望呢咱们国际社会，也包括呢就是各界的这个学者和这个组织，大家呢都应该呢重视每一个利益相关方的作用。那么第二个方面呢，我也简单说一下中国呢，就是我们的战略家和政治家，就是毛泽东先生呢，他有一个很著名的理论叫矛盾论。这个矛盾论呢，就是说，在我们面对一个问题的时候呢，其实呢，内部因素它是主要的因素，外部因素是通过内部因素在发挥作用所以我说呢，就是未来呢，中国在可持续消费这方面，我们对可持续大豆呢需要去做出努力和贡献。但是同时呢，我也非常强调我们的大豆的生产国家，因为他们的生产是要受他们国内的法律和政策所引导的也需要呢受到绿色标准和可持续的标准以及这个认证所引领的。所以呢，我也希望呢，就是生产国家在这个方面也能发挥重要的作用。我就说到这里，伊莎贝尔。
非常感谢张教授特别是提到了这个中国的这个5年的这个计划特别是从这个消费者还有这个人口人均介绍了这个中国的很重要的一个角色。 好，那下一位刘会长在吗？刘会长。刘会长在吗？
Isabel, Professor Liu was here earlier. We're just going to find him. So can I suggest you move on to the next panelist and we'll put you in touch with him shortly.
No, I saw Mr. Liu is waving his hand. You know, I'm not sure if he's able to disable his his mute mode. Yeah, now it's okay.
Oh,
Isabel, it's okay.
可以。
OK， 哦，可以好，刘会长晚上好。
你好。
刘会长认识很多人，都有很多老朋友们都在这里参加这个会所以也特别荣幸听到刘会长的分享。刘会长你那么多年都在这个打斗这个行业在这个中国的这个市场的最佳实践的经验还需要什么其他的一些支持继续推进这个负责任供应链的管理，特别是你参加那么多的这个可持续发展大斗的一些项目和活动，你觉得还需要什么样的支持？
好，大家下午好，很高兴又回到了RTRS这样一个团队里边来讨论问题。我参加过第8次，然后今天这个会上，我想和大家一块讨论一下在多少岁就是全球大队可持续发展中国角色。中国无疑在全世界引起了高度的重视，全世界大队的发展，中国的进口量占到了整个生产量的7%，这个总贸易占的57%，年进口1亿多吨，大家由于对环境问题的关心，就关心到大豆，同时也关心到中国。我想这个可持续发展问题 ，RTRS 一直做的工作，他们所不同的更偏重于行动，用了 RTRS 可持续负责任大豆这样一个理念，我很赞同。从2009年参加 RTRS 这个会议年会到现在，我一直从事这个荷兰和平基金会和 WWF 和好多国际组织一直在从事这个中国与南美可持续大豆供应链的研究，从事这个 RTRS 中国对转型大豆标准的研究，从事这个中国可持续大豆指南标准的研究。在这个研究过程中间，我就感觉到这个可持续发展必须要落实在法律上、理念上、标准上、行动上。所以中国在这方面用可持续发展的理念，用负责任的标准来衡量，中国有很多成功的经验，也有很多要做的工作。首先我觉得中国人大豆和人类比呢，大豆之所以成为人们关注，因为大豆的重要性，它都提供了70亿人口所需要食品里面的大豆蛋白质主要来源。所以动物饲养的肉蛋奶，它的饲料里面的蛋白质靠大豆。中国人食品里的肉蛋白来源主要靠大豆。所以大豆是现代人们生活提高营养健康最重要的因素，它是一个最敏感最重要的农产品，它的营养价值可以说是整个粮食产品的一种精华。那大豆生产的发展经历了一个从野生采集到培训到加工利用种植这个过程。大豆原产于中国，5000多年前中国已经开始种植大豆，然后中国的大豆又流传到全世界。2600年以前，中国的大豆食品加工，利用大豆做食品的主要原料。 大豆之所以发展最快，是因为需求发展很低。所以我今后50年来，大豆的生产量增加了13.5倍。所以这就不能引起人们对大豆的高度重视。大豆，人们从表面看，巴西在毁林种大豆，在这个问题，我们又要看到现象，看到现实，又要看到本质，看到历史。应该说，人类的根基都来自于垦荒对湿地草原森林的开发。只不过现在到了最宝贵的热带雨林这一块了，人们感到了威胁，感到了危机，所以就关注这个问题，就把毁林和大豆成立联系起来了。无疑，我们这种毁林开荒的速度和大豆增长的速度是不能持久的。你看，中国的进口量20年来平均每年增长19%，这个肯定是不能持久的。那么，怎么样才能保证持久呢？无疑要从全世界来考虑，要从总需求与总供给的关系来考虑，要调整总供给和总需求。这个实现可持续发展有很多理念，需要法律，需要标准，需要行动。那么我感觉到，实现可持续发展需要利益相关方的共同，不是某一个政府、某一个组织、某一个企业。首先，联合国一定在行动，关于控制气候变暖、关于环境保护、关于生物多样性，一定有很多公约规则。而且我觉得这个还需要完善，需要深入。第二，各个国家自身的发展，根据他们的历史阶段、现实情况，也在制定一些保护环境的法律，这些各个国家都在完善。第四呢，有关国际组织、行业协会也结合本行业的特点，制定了相关的，总结了相关的经验，也制定了相关的原则和标准，入入中国的可持续大豆发展的指南。第四个，与农业生产、农产品加工贸易有关的企业和跨国公司，也要在遵守联合国规定和各国法律的基础上，制定自己的本企业的标准，用市场的力量来促进可持续发展。第五，消费者与社会组织要广泛宣传保护可持续发展、负责任的理念，来执行标准，来选择产品。第六，可持续发展还需要绿色金融体系的思考，银行应该设立有差别的农业投资政策，例如要促进中欧、南非药荒耕地的再开垦再利用，减少对热带雨林的压力。七，可持续大豆的发展还需要一个可持续的科学的思考。我们对提高土地生产率、提供栽培技术、提高农产品营养和利用率的新技术要给大家支持，同时要防止造成物种灭绝、危害食品安全的黑色科技的蔓延。但从中国来讲，我觉得有几个经验是值得给大家介绍的。第一，中国的农业文明在历史上就反对杀鸡取蛋、民间止渴，主张细水长流、节约用地的农业文化传统。第二，中国政府在制定“十三五”计划以及这次14步计划的时候，都提出了创新、协调、绿色、开放、共享的发展理念。习近平总书记在向全世界承诺，2030年实现碳达峰，2060年实现碳中和，这些都是中国政府负责任的表现。第三，中国有引流、提水灌溉、先捉套种、合理轮作等提高土地生产率的土地利用的传统的经验，这些经验到今天并没有过时。第四，中国政府退出盘林以及植树治沙等政策已经收到了良好的效果， 近10年来，我们的森林覆盖率增加了1.6倍，达到了23.04%的水平。这个虽然水平很低，但是它的发展速度是可喜的。第5，中国创造了大豆食品文化，直接用豆芽、豆浆腐熟，满足了人体对蛋白质的需要。直接以大豆粕作为动物饲料，对动物饲料所提供的肉蛋呢做食品，这样一个曲折的一个供应链来说，大豆食品更利于直接吸收大豆蛋白质，是一个节约蛋白质资源的一个途径。中国还有一些新措施可以利用。第一，
刘会长，不好意思，时间的原因，
对，
还有1分
钟，
不好意思。
中国要发展大豆加工业，直接利用大豆提出了双蛋白的这个营养结构。第二，中国和南美合作制定了可持续的贸易研究标准，中粮、中粗粮、韭菜、油脂都公开宣布，我们不采购回民种植大豆。第三，中国提出了双蛋白营养工程。第4，中国产业技术体系提高了土地利用率和大豆的生产率。第5，最后一个，中国提出来要履行节约的原则，杜绝食品浪费。全世界的粮食浪费要达到23%，中国的餐桌浪费其中包括了17%。如果我们减少10%个百分点，那么我们对生产供应提供的这个矛盾就会减少，对土地压力就会减少，对环境的保护就会做出贡献。最后，我觉得这个地球是一个整体，我们可持续发展需要大家都负起责任来，一定要形成共同的理念，制定各自的法律，来制定行业的标准。我们通过制定标准、执行标准，才能达到可持续发展的结果。
谢谢刘会长的精彩分享特别是已经就是从10年前就是特别了解所有的在中国大豆行业的可持续发展的一些进展和项目谢谢刘会长因为时间的原因，我就请下一位来自生态环境部赵阳先生赵老师你好。我就问你，就是关于一些政府的政策，哪些政策能够帮助鼓励行业的绿色转型因为我知道赵老师也是特别在准备中国组织、联合国组织的生物多样性大会还有包括一些生物多样性和产业的一些年会还有一些气候变化的一些新的计划，所以请赵老师从你的角度和经验你觉得从政策方面怎么去帮助鼓励行业和企业？
你好，伊莎贝尔，你好，是这样，我们都知道现在基于自然的解决方案就是 nature-based solution。中国呢正在这个联合国这个授权下中国正在牵头做这个 NBS。我们知道 NBS 呢是生物多样性公约和这个联合国气候变化公约2大公约能够协同增效的这个一个非常重要的举措，国际举措。那这个基于自然的解决方案 NBS 呢，它主要就是恢复自然的生态系统以及那些经过改造的，是吧？可以说半人工的那种生态系统。通过恢复生态系统的这个生物多样性呢，能够减缓和应对气候变化。所以呢，就是在国际层面中国这个 在联合国层面主导的这个基于自然的解决方案哈，这个能够协同生物多样性减缓和适应气候变化，这是一个。在国内呢，我们知道十四五规划当中呢，我们可以看到它的这个最重要的目标呢，就是我们叫立足新发展阶段，贯彻新发展理念，构建新发展格局，推动高质量发展。这个高质量发展，中国也在讲究这个 high quality development。那什么是 high quality 呢？是吧？刚才呢，我们可以说，就从我们的产业，从大豆这个产业来说呢，怎么能够做到 high quality 这种发展哈？那我们可以看到，中国呢，它提出来就是在这个农业食品领域，就是 agri-food sector， 农业食品领域的话呢，我们大豆呢也在其中是吧？而且扮演着很重要的角色比如在饲料在食品，在添加剂，在这个调味料等等，是吧？就是提出了一个什么呢？提出了这个叫生态产品的价值实现机制，China is launching the mechanism to realize value for ecological products。那这里边就是什么 high quality development， 还有这个 ecological products， 是吧？这些呢都与我们的这个大豆的这个生产贸易呢可能会产生一些关联。然后我们还知道就是这个 COVID-19 pandemic， 是吧？就是 is making the global chain even more precarious。那中国呢，就是在这种情况下呢，我们怎么能够 rebuild the supply chain， 是吧 ？For agri-food， for eco products， 我们就提到了一个什么，叫以国内大循环为主体，国内国际双循环相互促进这是一个新发展的格局。就是说呢，中国呢China is not only depending on the global supply chain for beef, for palm oil, for soy. China is also building its domestic supply chain for the production of this soft commodities. That's going to be a tendency, hopefully, in my opinion, in the future, because这是中国第二个 tendency。那我觉得，这样的话呢，我们还可以看到什么呢？看到就是在这个农业食品这一块呢，我们可以看到就是在双碳目标我1分钟就可以了。双碳目标的这个要覆盖到各行各业，是吧？要覆盖到所有企业，这可能会出现一些像信息披露一些补贴的改革，是吧？绿色投资、可持续采购、负责任消费这些方式，是吧？能够使这个生物多样性、生态保护的目标跟这个双碳目标能够相结合。这样的话呢，就是要这个我们可能会看到这行业中有更多的这个市场认证认可，是吧？有一些像这个生态产品的溢价，是吧？这些可能都会出现。好，谢谢大家。
谢谢赵老师，特别是从这个环境部最近也就是发布了很多一些工作和进展和一些政策方面的 nature-based solutions，然后也提到了一些金融，还有一些投资者和信息披露，所以我觉得这个是一个好的可以请下一位来自 CDP 方立方来自就是全球环境信息研究中心然后也特别期待介绍一些中国的这个从CDP 的这个方法跟企业和投资者的一些交流和合作所以立方中国如何看的标准的使用促进负责任供应链，你觉得中国有什么样的角色？
好的，非常感谢伊莎贝尔，也感谢主办方的邀请，有机会来分享一下 CDP 在负责任大豆领域的一些工作吧。就是 CDP 其实刚才伊莎贝尔介绍到，其实是一个全球最大的一个环境信息披露平台。那我们其实是利用一是投资者，第二是通过采购机构的力量来邀请投资的企业和供应商来披露他们的环境信息。那其实2020年呢，全球总共是已经有超过9600家企业通过 CDP 的平台来披露包括气候变化、水和森林相关的一些环境表现。那当然中国其实是非常重要的一个市场那我们看到去年呢，总共有超过了1300家企业。中国的企业参与到整个这样的一个环境信息披露的工作中来无论说是供应链范围3的一些碳排放管理，还是森林风险商品的一些负责任采购，我们看到越来越多的中国企业其实是在提升透明度开展低碳转型或者负责任采购，甚至是有一些企业已经开始邀请它的供应商一起来协作开展了很多的工作，也取得了一些进展。那比如说我们来看中国基于 CDP 2020年的这样一个数据，我们看到已经有超过40家企业来填报CDP 的这样一个森林问卷。那这样披露的一个企业的数量也好，或者是说披露的信息的质量也好都有一个显著的一个提升。那在森林的一个供应链项目中，我们也看到了中国企业的身影。2019年的时候，2019年的时候，福建的盛隆集团成为中国第1家供应链的一个企业合作伙伴。那它也是支持到全球跟全球21个供应链的合作伙伴一起在中国邀请在华的供应商一起来披露森林信息。那其中就包括大豆、木材、棕榈油、牛制品这样的一些信息。然后呢，是期待跟供应商伙伴一起去管理它的森林供应链。那盛隆本身来说，其实我们说中国的案例来说的话，盛隆本身它自身的披露来说，2020年它在森林问卷里头得分其实是最高的企业之一了。它已经在开始做或者是说已经开始评估可持续大豆的采购和认证的工作，包括是否去采用 RTRS 的一个这样一个第三方认证的体系做一些相关的调研。那据我的了解，他们现在已经在开始做一些执行计划。那但是呢，其实对于大豆这个产品来说，其实从 CDP 的一个数据来看，从披露的数据来看其实相对于木材或者棕榈油来说，工作相对于来说要落后一些这是全球范围的一个数据。比方说全球去年是有687家企业来回复 CDP 的森林问卷，那只有135家是披露了大豆的信息的那在中国来说，其实只有3家了。那这样的话，我们可以看到无论是说这些企业在识别森林风险也好，或者说制定森林相关的一些政策，可持续大豆采购相关的政策，或者设定采购的目标，其实这方面其实有很多的一些提升的空间的。那在这一块如何去推进我们会是觉得提升意识和能力建设应该是目前所需要做的。那刚才其实张教授也提到需要发挥各利益相关方的作用。那我想这其实不仅仅是中国企业那同样也是摆在全球企业共同的一个课题。那另外我想多说的一点就是说，涉及到一些标准其实刘会长刚才也提到要去发挥绿色金融的作用。那我们也是关注到今年4月份人行还有发改委还有证监会其实发布了绿色债券支持项目目录这样一个更新的一个清单。那这里头其实是明确鼓励绿债要去支持大宗绿色农产品的一个贸易。那这里头是其实明确提到了要去支持获得国际相关认证体系的一个可持续证书的一个农产品。那这里面其实应该是要包括RTRS 认证的。那 CDP 其实最近今年开始也在邀请就是中国的一些金融机构了，期待他们去来向 CDP 披露他们的信贷和投资组合中的一些混凝风险。那我们也是期待就是说在企业披露相关的信息的基础上价值链上的企业去披露相关的信息基础上呢，我们也是期待中国的金融机构能够再去推进包括可持续大豆在内的 它的一些供应链方面和可持续供应链的管理上发挥重要的作用啊。我就先介绍这些。
谢谢精彩分享，特别是提到了一些最近的一些进展，特别是省能有这样持续大豆的一个承诺和政策计划因为时间的原因我看到在聊天区只有一个问题所以我就先说这个问题是关于欧盟最近也有一些关于大豆的可持续发展，还有特别是这个森林保护的一些政策和法律法规，所以不知道嘉宾专家就是从中国的这个角度怎么去看这个欧盟的一些最近的一些政策，特别是他们有一些零回零的一些承诺和政策，你们觉得中国政府会不会跟就是比较像欧盟也会就是有这样的一个法律法规，或者还会继续用一些志愿性的一些标准？不知道有没有专家要回答这个问题
？Isabel, this is John. This is John. Okay. Voluntary standards are regarded as soft laws in the EU, right? For example, in EU, there is directive on information disclosure on non-financial information, etc. But in China, there are governmental organized NGOs. I'm talking about industry associations. They integrate biodiversity or climate change, related indicators into the industry associations guidelines. So I believe, they undertake similar responsibilities as the standard organizations in the Western world. However, in China, we don't have a gray zone between the government and also the civil society. The governmental organized NGOs are undertaking, is playing very similar role. However, we do use labeling, certification, and accreditation in China. And I'm afraid that, they apply international voluntary standards. It's like market-based competitive, on competitive basis. So it's possible that in the future that, the most competitive voluntary standards might stand out in China, because this is chosen by the contestability of markets. Back to you, Isabel.
Great, thank you. 谢谢赵老师的分享然后因为时间的原因，我们还有2分钟，我就做一个这个中国论坛的这个总结，然后我会用英文跟大家分享。Thank you, everyone. We just have 2 minutes left in the China panel discussion. I'm going to use English to do a quick summary of some of the main points made by our speakers today. And thank you, everyone, for listening. The time really flew by, but very excited to hear the comments and remarks from our great speakers and panelists today. So just to summarize the China panel, and I think it's very clear that China plays a very important role in the global soy supply chain, and especially for promoting sustainability and responsibility. At the same time, as mentioned by our speakers, Professor Zhang, Mr. Liu, and others, that we still have to consider China's development path, and it's still a little bit different than other developed countries. So we have to consider, despite the population size, we also have to think about where China is in terms of its development, and it's still a bit different than other major markets like Europe. At the same time, I think China has some great developments, especially on the side of environmental protection. As Mr. Zhao also mentioned, China is, with the upcoming COP15 that China will be hosting later this year, also the commitment on becoming carbon neutral by 2060 made by President Xi. China is investing a lot of different efforts to address these and come into compliance and meet these ambitious goals, including the nature-based solutions. But also this gives a great opportunity for standards, as Mr. Liu also shared that it's important within the industry to have both the laws and regulations in place to promote sustainability and give the incentive, but also to have standards within the industry to help define what is sustainable and responsible. At the same time, several of our speakers also remarked that it needs to be shared responsibility, which is, of course, the topic of today's meeting point. So, how to share the responsibility across the supply chain, from producers all the way to the consumers, like consumer markets such as China and Europe, and working together. But there's also some really great developments and methods that can also be used that are also increasing developments in China from the investor's perspective, also green finance, and these can be good incentivizing tools that can be used across the industry. So once again, thank you everyone. This has been a great discussion. Of course, I think we could talk a lot more time about the role of China, and hope to have more opportunities to discuss with everyone. Thank you again to the China panelist speakers, and talk to everyone soon. Thank you. Back to you, James.
Thanks, Isabel, and impeccable timing. So that was our gong to signal the end of the first panel. Let me just thank you first and foremost for doing a fantastic job to moderate the session. Thanks to our speakers as well for their contributions. I think for those of us who followed the RTRS journey and been in some of the face-to-face meetings over the years, we've always had a challenge of bringing en masse Chinese participants to this space. So it's been fantastic to really get an opportunity to hear the perspectives that are emerging and the policies that are emerging out of China at the moment. So thank you, colleagues, for taking your time to contribute there. We're going to go shortly on to the next panel, but as I said at the beginning today, this meeting point is slightly different to just a webinar, which is why you can see 256 participants in the room. So we're all here together. We have an opportunity to network later. So please do be ready to turn on your camera and meet other people in the room after the second panel. Don't be shy. And please do post your questions in Slido as well. So we will put the link up there. Do get your questions out there so we can really interact with the panelists on our next panel. We've got about 7 minutes until the next panel starts. And we thought it was really important between the panels to have some interludes. So we're going to do a short timeout now, in which you're going to be witnessing an experience on the screen, a live immersive experience. What we're going to show you is a tiny reminder of the journey of the soybean itself. Now, many of you will be familiar with this journey, but we wanted to invite you to immerse yourselves in that journey, both as an opportunity to take a break from the panels, but also as a chance to connect with what is at the core of our discussions today. So take a time out with us, make yourself comfortable in your chair, step back from your work today and take a deep breath, and join us over the next 5 minutes on a live immersive experience.
We invite you now to take a break from the panels and to follow us on a journey with soybean. It's a long journey across the globe that involves many professionals. And as you immerse yourself in this experience, why don't you explore what stands out for you on the journey? Is it the modern technology associated with soy production? Is it the diversity of people and the biodiversity of the natural world? Or is it the unique place that soy occupies between food, farming, and environment? A journey begins in a field where organic material from last year's crop provides the nutrients for future generations. Many hands make light work. For the seeds to germinate, requiring several inputs, fertile soil, and of course, nature's sun and rain. The seeds meet the soil. The first shoots find their way through the soil and emerge into the light. Soy provides a living wage and a source of employment to local communities. And also learning opportunities for future. Delicate flowers begins to flourish in the field. And not long after, the flowers turn into fruits and mature soy pods are ready to be harvested. Around the soy sector, many other industries thrives: mechanical parts, fertilizers, tools, and infrastructure. The harvest begins. Technology, innovation, and investment all have a key role to play. The soybeans are transferred to transport. The potential of each tiny grain weighing heavy. The sheer size of the storage set against the size of the soybeans give us some idea of how important this work is. Investment in research and development means that the value chain is constantly modernizing. And back to the chain, the grains are milled, the soy travels on its way to destinations all across the globe. One example of many possible destinations is to feed cattle. That produces milk that will be used as a key ingredient in several products we consume daily. And many more on our tables. And when soy is produced responsibly, all this happens while rich, diverse natural landscapes thrive.
Thank you so much, Michele. Time to move straight on with our next panel, panel 2, the benefits and challenges of environmental footprinting. Quick housekeeping reminders. First is that this panel will all be in English. So if you require translation, please do click on the interpretation board at the bottom of the screen and choose the language of your preference. And a reminder that you can put questions to our panelists through Slido. We'll continue to post the link there and we'll see the questions coming in live. So we'll leave enough time in the next panel to explore some of those questions with the panelists. Let me introduce the next moderator of our session, Jan-Joris van Diepen, and he'll introduce the speakers. Jan-Joris is Senior Consultant at Blanc Consultants. Fantastic to have you with us today. Jan-Joris, over to you.
Thank you, James, for the introduction. Indeed, my name is Jan-Joris van Diepen, and I'm working as a Senior Consultant within Blanc Consultants. And we are helping RTRS right now on setting up their environmental footprint project. Yeah, I won't do this session alone. Together, I have some representatives of the feed and the food industry. So the panelists of today are Nick Major. He is Director Corporate Affairs of 4Farmers and Chair of the Board of the GFLI, the Global Feed LCA Institute. And also together with me is Will Schreiber. He is representative of the Retail Soy Group and partner of Freekeel. So these are the panelists of today. As James said, we have first about 20 minutes to have some discussion with the panelists. And after that, there is also some space from questions from the audience. So please let me know your questions on the Slido app, and then we can discuss this later on. Yeah, before I will ask the panel members to give their perspective on the topic of environmental footprinting, let me first explain a bit how to calculate the environmental footprint for people who don't have a lot of technical background. So to calculate environmental footprints, we use life cycle assessment methodology, LCA. And with this methodology, we look at all inputs and outputs and emissions that occur along the value chain. So we look at each life cycle stage of the product, starting from cultivation up to transport, processing, use of product, and disposal. Of course, carbon footprint is the hot topic today, and also where the main interest is in. But environmental footprint also looks at other environmental indicators that are taken into account. So then we're talking about, for example, land use, water consumption, eutrophication, acidification, fine particulate matter. So other environmental indicators that are relevant, specifically in this case for the agri-food production. And it's also good to realize that, with LCA, we cannot capture all sustainability issues. So important sustainability topics like biodiversity and soil quality are not well captured in LCA. So right now we are working with RTRS on environmental footprinting, a roadmap of their products. And one of the first steps that we took was a stakeholder analysis to find out what are the market requirements regarding environmental footprinting. Because there has been a lot of developments in LCA standardization. If you look at the past years, there's done a lot of work within the PEF framework, the product environmental footprint of the European Commission, and for example in GFLI. Both developments we as bond consultants are also involved in. So before starting up an LCA project and starting up environmental footprint, calculate environmental footprint, it's very good to align with the requested industry standards. And actually what RTRS is doing right now, so calculating the environmental footprint of your specific product, that's a development that we see happening all around us. Currently, most companies, when they are making inventories of their carbon footprint, for example, and disclosing via the CDP, which is also mentioned earlier today, or making the greenhouse gas inventory, companies have to use databases with default environmental footprint information of crops of certain countries. But as now a lot of companies are setting targets, also CO2 reduction targets, it's really necessary to go into the supply chain and get the real data. So we see this development all around us, that producers are starting their own environmental footprinting projects. Just as a quick introduction on what's environmental footprinting and some developments, but I'm also curious to hear the opinions of our panel members. So maybe Will, you could start and tell something about the perspective of the food industry and retail. What are the concerns and requirements regarding environmental footprinting?
Great, thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting us to speak today on this really important topic. For an end user, there's been a significant amount of pressure on understanding the environmental impact of the products that are sold on shelf. And particularly with this year, with COP26 and the International Climate Convention later this year, we've seen many companies, whether they're brands or retailers or hospitality sector organizations, developing new strategies and policies that are looking at bridging these gaps. And of course, they need to be aligned with evidence and information and supply chain specific data, as as expertly introduced a moment ago. And one of the gaps that's currently trying to be addressed is this alignment between deforestation and climate change. And whilst there are a number of different environmental metrics, with climate change being one of the top priorities and deforestation being another one of the top priorities, bridging that gap to start with is certainly one of the top agenda items within boardrooms and discussions regarding how companies are going to be moving forward. And this is all the more important in the context of deforestation, as we've seen that the Amazon rainforest has become a net emitter of carbon emissions because of the land use policies and because of the land use change that's taking place. Yet we don't see net zero strategies necessarily explicitly referencing this type of issue within the approaches of businesses. You'll see a lot about how they're looking to incorporate carbon removals or planting new trees, but we're not yet seeing the connection of, well, we'll stop converting the land and cutting down the trees that are already there. So historically, many companies that have science-based climate targets don't actually incorporate deforestation within their supply chain inventories. And there's been a variety and a clear inconsistency in the approaches that companies have been using to try to address this. Indeed, consultants as well, in how they're trying to address this. And as was also introduced, there's a bit of house of cards with environmental footprinting, where you have lots and lots of assessments that are based on fewer and fewer data points. And if one of those data points goes wrong from one of these databases, then an entire strategy can collapse or can look very different from what the situation actually is that's been communicated. So there's a lot of hesitance in how it is that you publicly communicate something like this when you don't have the data or the information, and there's a lot of uncertainty in there. But the challenge is critical that we have to address this, recognizing that we don't really have an oven-ready solution where somebody can just say, I know what my footprint is and here's what my strategy is underneath it. And we have a real risk right now of lots of misleading reporting claims or targets that are coming out that aren't necessarily based on the removals that might be happening. So very happy to be here, and we can explore these thoughts on this panel.
Thank you, Will, for the introduction. And indeed, the topics that you mentioned are very relevant. I was also thinking on the same time the methodology issues that we have on how deforestation should be quantified in LCA, which is also a difficult topic, but I will not go into the details. Nick, maybe you can also tell something about the latest developments that you see in the feed industry regarding environmental footprinting.
Yeah, thanks, Jan Joris, and yeah, thanks to RTRS for the invitation. And I'm quite happy to pick up the land use change one, perhaps in a minute or two, because there is that absolutely that bridge. But just to provide a sort of feed industry perspective, and just to give the background. So the feed industry has been working on, yeah, and you've mentioned one or two of them, a whole number of projects really to develop that common methodology and data set, actually, which will just set out, so that basically sort of everyone in the livestock supply chain can first of all obviously analyze their environmental footprint, and then of course start to improve it. And we start really with FAO back in 2012 with the LEAP partnership, which was that sort of multi-stakeholder process which set out the methodology for calculating the environmental footprint in livestock supply chains. And then, as you've mentioned, the EU picked that up with the product environmental footprint. And actually animal feed, feed for food producing animals was one of the pilot studies, one of the 20 or so pilot studies that was involved in that. And then that was published, finalized in 2016, and I think published in around 2018. So effectively there is a PEFCR, a product environmental footprint category rules, which is, if you like, the rule book signed off by the JRC and the Commission as to how you calculate the environmental footprint of 1 ton of animal feed delivered to the farm. So that's the methodology. Then where GFLI comes in is then you need a data set. You need the emissions from the feed materials. And so we put together as a feed industry this sort of independent non-profit organization established in 2015, and last year in 2020 we published our latest version of the data set. So there is, if you find the GFLI website, a data set free to access. Anybody can access it, just have to sign a user license agreement, and there's 1,000 data sets of all common feed materials, as you've just mentioned, not just carbon. I sometimes talk about carbon footprinting when I really mean environmental footprinting. That's because at the moment, most people ask me about carbon, but there are 19 impact categories in the GFLI database. And so that's the sort of the background, the history. So the context for a feed industry, just to sort of set it out there and then move on, which is that feed production represents 45% of the carbon footprint of livestock products. You know, that's a global average. It changes. It's slightly less with ruminants. It's quite a lot more when it comes to swine and poultry. And as a feed producer, when I look at the environmental footprint of a ton of feed delivered to one of my customers, over 90% of that comes from the feed materials that we use. So exactly what you've just said, you know, the cultivation, fertilizer, the inbound logistics. So that's 90%. That's for us, that's our scope 3, our upstream emissions. What we actually do as feed manufacturers, manufacturing it and delivering to the farmer, our scope 1 and scope 2 is 10%. Yeah, and that's quite a revelation. So the interest in environmental footprints is increasing, as Will has described. Feed companies are now starting to provide that information on a regular basis. They're incorporating the values into their formulation systems and starting to provide that information, as my own company does, to our customers on request.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. And yeah, I really think the GFLI is a nice example of how an industry can pick this up and facilitate environmental footprint information for user groups. And also, I think it's very nice that there is a framework developed to also incorporate indeed producer-specific information, and in this way, this can be enrich the database. And I think this is really also an example for other industries to pick up. Yeah, I already talked a bit about in the introduction of the limitations of LCA. Sustainability is, of course, a broad issue. Will, could you maybe tell a bit how you think that environmental footprinting responds to the stakeholder expectations and concerns?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good question. And I'm not going to be using lots of slides to talk through all the different permutations, but I was allowed just one slide. And I think that it's important because one of the main things that we're looking at here is that in order for environmental footprinting to be credible, we're going to need to be able to match it to transparency. And the communication of this is what's going to be really key. And I'm just going to put one slide up there. Apologies that it's not in every language that's represented today, but it's the bars that I'd like everybody to just be looking at for a moment. Because what we can see here is that based upon what municipality or area you're growing soy in Brazil, for example, you can have quite a significant different footprint associated with it. And this is just for climate change for a kilogram of soybean. And you can see that in some areas, it can be 4 times greater than in others. And the challenge that we have with this is that whilst you can get a database that pulls up a single top level figure, it's very difficult to then make a company claim to say that you've reduced emissions, you've avoided emissions. And you might even say that you can't actually make those claims. And because our sectors are quite separate right now, you have carbon accounting or environmental accounting, and you have people working on deforestation, there's a lot of learning that's not being applied just yet. So while some people might want to claim that there's reductions, and other people might want to claim that they've avoided emissions, is that actually right? If we were thinking about BP or Shell, and they said that they've reduced their footprint because they didn't build an oil well, would that have any credibility? Would it be fair to say that you've avoided emissions when you may not have ever actually cleared the land or converted it? So for downstream users like retailers, having the transparency to know where soy is coming from today is critical if there's going to be a baseline for any type of claim about how their supply chain has improved from one year to the next. And that creates a real challenge because the data doesn't exist for that right now. It's not available, but we need to be able to show the impact of our actions. So we see many that might be refraining, but when one company does this, there's going to be the floodgates that open up, and we're going to get lots of claims of avoided or lost deforestation or reduced soy footprints, when the reality is the vast majority of soy isn't coming from deforested and converted land. A small part is. So how do you weight that and bring everything together? So there are these limitations of the life cycle assessment approaches that NYAR has opened up with around that. And some are breaking norms by looking at shorter time periods for conversion, and there's some technical aspects that are going into it. But we need to make sure that we're recognizing how more immediate action is having some sort of benefit associated with it, but it needs to be a credible benefit. And the best working group for this right now is from the World Resources Institute, which is developing new guidance on how all these considerations are coming together. But we don't know the outcome of that yet. And it's still a year or two away from coming out there. And that's not fast enough for what many people are looking to do. So I would bet that in the next few months, we'll be seeing some announcements that come out from some businesses that won't be credible or be substantiated by the information that's available. So ultimately, should you be communicating a benefit if you don't know where your starting point is? And it's a bit of a minefield. So we need to make sure that we have credible reference points and approaches that are available that everybody can use. So it's certainly one where there's lots of opportunity, but one where we have to tread a bit carefully to make sure that we're all not claiming that we've saved a Brazil-sized land footprint when it's only that big. That was the problem to start with.
Yeah, thank you, Will. I think it's a really important issue, and indeed, I also see that a lot of companies are setting targets right now, but they don't know their benchmark yet. What's their starting point, because they didn't go into the supply chain yet to get all the real data. So it's based on defaults, and then if you go from a default to another default, or from a default to real data, then you cannot talk over improvement yet. So I think you're really right about this aspect. Maybe Nick, I'm thinking you could say that in the feed industry, because we have now a really good standard, which is the PFCR, and really takes into account all the activity data that you need to collect, and all the calculation rules are really defined. So you could say that in the feed industry there is already like a good tool to go through take these steps. do you already see a lot of feed companies using this methodology now? And also, are their clients asking for this kind of information?
It's starting, and yeah, if you'd have asked me 2 or 3 years ago, I would have said I don't quite understand why no one's asking us for the information, because we've been working for 5 or 6 years to make sure that it's ready and available. But actually that's changed. Even in the last 12 months, I would say more and more customers and usually the processors and the retailers are starting to ask for that information. So yeah, it's starting to get there. And I think just on this point about linking responsible sourcing with carbon footprinting, because I think this is really where now the real interesting conversation is taking place. Once people start measuring it, then they start looking at what the key drivers are. And I agree exactly with what Will has just said. There are two things. First of all, two things it's starting to drive. First of all, you can't do a serious environmental footprint in the feed industry if you don't know where your raw materials are coming from. So this whole debate about starting for feed producers to ask their suppliers about country of origin, which at one level you might say, well, you know, of course you should know that information, but we all know it's not quite as straightforward as that. And then at country of origin level, yeah, we're currently relying on a lot of published data, and Jan Joris, you know, you Blanc have been involved in this, so you'll know more about this than I am. But actually, you want that granular data, that branded data, if you like, from scheme owners and from other companies who are able to delve down and get that information. And obviously, from a GFLI point of view, you know, we would encourage all of the owners of that data to come forward and talk to us and help us provide that data in a way that meets the sort of required standards, you know, and the data quality thresholds. And just to think about land use change for a moment, because actually the PEF does include a section on land use change, but it requires, and Jan Joris, correct me if I'm wrong, in order to exclude land use change, you've got to be able to prove that the land hasn't been cleared for over 20 years or for 20 years. So when you're looking at country averages, you know, that's a real challenge, as Will has just said. And as people are starting to calculate their carbon footprint from a feed producer, soy is just a huge element of that. And when you attach land use change to the numbers for soy, it just makes a huge difference. In fact, it's so significant, it passes through that, you know, that number gets all the way through right to the final number, you know. So with and without land use change really makes a huge difference. So I think, you know, what I would hope is that more people start focusing on environmental footprint. It will exactly drive the sort of innovation and development that we've just been talking to. It should be an incentive to scheme owners and for branded data owners to come forward with that data, so that we're not relying on those country averages.
Yeah. Well, and I think this is a development that is happening right now. So RTRS is starting up footprint projects. There are other producers starting up the footprint project. So yeah, hopefully in the upcoming years we will get better, high quality data of footprint information of soy products and other products in general. Okay, thank you. Let's see if there are some questions popping up, and we can see who can answer them. Let me see. We have a question: how to determine the source of imported soybeans? In other words, is there any way to identify imported soybeans produced by deforestation? Yeah, so this is about sourcing and chain of custody. Maybe Nick, Will, who wants to pick up this question?
Well, I think that would be a question I would ask Nick normally, so I think it could go straight to him.
And Will does ask me that question on a fairly regular basis, and so yeah, I mean the chain of custody is the right answer. And obviously at the moment, you know, I think it's fair, and I can only speak from a European perspective, obviously, and you know, the feed industry again has been proactive here with the FIFAC soy sourcing guidelines, and that broadly acts, or works on a certification model. So RTRS and a number of other scheme owners have benchmarked themselves against the RTRS guidelines. There's in the new guidelines, there's 70 criteria. It's not just about deforestation; it's about a whole other set of criteria. The challenge is, to be honest, is that the starting point is book and claim, and that, you know, that is a starting point, and that makes it quite difficult. But you see more and more interest now in moving up the chain of custody to sort of mass balance and area mass balance, where you start to bring, if you like, the certificates that you're purchasing into much closer alignment with the actual physical material. And I think as well, as a feed producer, we're asking our suppliers for more and more information. So we might be buying on an any origin contract, for example, but if we've done that for, say, the last 12 months, I still want to know where it came from. And we're getting that information now. And the next level of information will be, okay, I've now got country of origin. Now, for obvious reasons that everyone on this meeting understands, I need to know which region it came from. So we're getting there, but we're moving up that chain of custody.
I think just one element to add, if that's all right, which is that there are other drivers for this too. And I think particularly with the incoming due diligence requirements stemming from Europe and the United Kingdom, we will see that this isn't going to be optional information. And certainly with many of the companies involved, they do this level of transparency for other commodities. And it's about making sure that this happens for soy and feed components as well. So there is a challenge right now, but we would expect that there's going to be a lot of movement on it fairly quickly, and the consistency in the ask that's going up for that transparency is also expanding in a more consistent way.
Thanks. And I think also the third question here is related to that. So this, about the sourcing, but also about calculating LCAs, and that's also maybe an interesting aspect, because what kind of detail is needed in your chain of custody to also say, okay, I can base my life cycle assessment on this. And actually, we're also talking with, for example, the FIFAC, if we can develop some more guidelines on this. So because this also in the European framework, there's not a lot of guidance on how you should apply this chain of custody systems on your LCA work. So I hope that there will be some developments there as well in the upcoming time. Then I think we had a question about the secondary data for LCA and environmental footprint information. The GFLI is already mentioned. So for the feed industry, that's now the international database, and I think really the standard for environmental footprint information in the feed industry. Then if you look at agri-food products in general, we have our own agri-footprint database that's available in LCA software and also on our website. Of course, there are all other kinds of LCA databases available. There is the EcoInvent database, which has environmental information of all kinds of products, so not only agri-footprint, agro products, but also other products. So there are a couple of LCA databases available, which are available. You can purchase, or they are freely available, or they are available in the LCA software. There's also, I didn't mention the database of the European Commission. So also within the PEF framework, there is a database which is freely available if you use it within a PEF study. So in this database, you will find this kind of environmental footprint information. But indeed, it's based on country averages. So that's also always good to take into account, specifically when we are talking about these land use change impacts. Let me see, what else do we have? How to deal with indirect land use change effect in case everyone from Europe wants to source from low carbon footprint regions. Anyone in opinion on that? Nick, Will?
Well, go on, Will. Now after you.
Yeah, that's not the solution. So I suppose is the main thing. If we're trying to deal with this challenge, then we can't be looking at developing bespoke supply chains that simply deflect the issue to buyers that are less concerned than you are about trying to deal with this. So I think that one of the key things for this is the way that companies need to view what their impacts and opportunities are for influencing production and focusing their efforts on looking at that systemic change, as opposed to saying that you know, if I have my feed bin here, this stuff's okay. So don't worry about everything else we've dealt with deforestation, when in reality, it's just a paperwork change that's taken place to say that that's gone to one company over another and the actual conversion is still occurring. So I think that the way you deal with it is you have to, yeah, you have to differentiate between your supply chain and your work, which is trying to transform the sector and work at that higher level. And you still might have hygiene components that you have to respond to for your own stakeholders and customers. But that needs to be dealt with separately. And the actual strategy and the focus of your efforts shouldn't be about nitpicking an individual supplier. It should be about trying to transform the system. And all of our efforts should be trying to deal with this urgently and broadly.
Yeah, and so I completely agree. I was only going to add that we've talked already about potential incoming legislation both in the EU and the UK, and all I'm going to say is it is one of the, you know, the principles of the legislation is absolutely fantastic. No one's going to argue with that. It's that whole just unintended consequences that you have to look out for, and that is one of them. So either you get a sort of a risk aversion, so that companies, you know, who are going to be asked to demonstrate due diligence start to take a low risk approach and try to either avoid you know, higher risk regions, or they reformulate. You know, and that's not, I mean, I know, and Will said it, you know, that's not the objective of the legislation. If that's what happens, the legislation will have failed. But I think it's one of those things where, you know, the legislation has to be well written so that it actually doesn't have that unintended consequence.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Phil. I think this is also an interesting one. What would you recommend companies to make to make a start today, given guidance maybe 1 to 2 years away? So what, as a company, could you already do? I can make a start, and then please, Nick and Major, add to it. I think there's already quite some standards that you can use when you want to start your footprinting. So we already mentioned the Product Environmental Footprint Framework of the European Commission. We mentioned the GFLI, and those standards really give guidance on what kind of data you need to collect from at farm level, for example. And of course, there can be maybe some adaptations in the methodology in the greenhouse gas protocol, but I think that the data that you need to collect will not change a lot. So, and this is also how we are approaching it with RTRS. Looking at the guidelines, we know what kind of data to collect, and this is always the data collection in these kinds of projects is also always the most challenging. So yeah, you can start with the data collection already. Maybe anything to add, Nick and Will?
Yeah, so just make a start. You know, it'd been better if we'd all started 5 years ago, but it'd be the next best thing is to start now. And from a feed producer, so just from I'm here as a feed producer. So the key issues are, first of all, the one thing I know is my formulation, right? I know what percentage of raw materials I'm using, and with a bit, and I should know and will know where they're all coming from. So that allows you to use the emissions data from the raw materials that you're using, and there are various tools you get that use GFLI. You convert them into a delivered mill basis. So there you have your 90%. It's actually over 90%. I always say 90%. Just to be slightly on the safe side. That's 90% of your footprint. So what else do you need as a feed producer? You need principally your power usage, and everybody knows what their electricity bill is. They know how much gas they're using. They know how much diesel they're using to deliver the feed to their customers. There are conversion factors. There are guidelines everywhere. You can search them. You can use conversion factors to convert those into GHGs, and all of a sudden you've got a carbon footprint of a ton of feed. And what I said earlier is, just start somewhere, and then you start playing around the numbers. And there are an increasing number of tools. Some are very simple, what I would almost describe as calculators, through to full LCA software aimed at this sector, and start playing around with the numbers, looking where the hotspots are. What happens if what a lot of my feed colleagues do when they start is they run the numbers, they start and they start including raw materials or reducing raw material. What happens if I do this or do that? And that just starts to get the sort of vocabulary and the expertise going within the business, and suddenly you've got people talking about scope 1 and 2 and scope 3 emissions. It's great, but you've got to just start somewhere.
And I suppose just a small, I guess the thing to add to that is I would actually recommend that you start with the origin transparency as the key thing, because what won't work is if you just say, well, here's my soy and it's all from Brazil and it's a rolled up Brazilian factor. And now we're going to say it's zero conversion and therefore it's this other factor, and just apply it and say, well, now we've saved 1 million tons of carbon. And to be clear, when we've done these assessments using that type of approach, which is what most people do right now, deforestation conversion can be over 10% of a company's supply chain footprint. It can be a really substantial amount. That doesn't mean it is that amount, but you won't be able to answer that question if you don't know how much is coming from which areas and what the land use change situation is in that area. So I think before you start going to farmers and collecting information, before you start going to the feed manufacturers and saying, can you give us, you know, the specific energy consumption of your factory and everything else, sorting out transparency has so many more benefits to it. And I think if you get that right, then you'll be able to use some of these data sets more effectively for understanding what your situation is. And my final remark on that is be realistic and don't set a baseline for 5 years ago. You don't have transparency for 5 years ago. You're operating today. So be realistic in what information you have and when it is that you might be able to set it, and don't set a baseline on something you don't understand, because it could indicate a huge footprint that doesn't actually exist and then create an artificial reduction which never took place. And that type of media is unwelcome, and I think it'll expose companies to criticism, rightfully so, if it's done in a slapdash way. So focus on transparency, I would say, would be the main thing to get started.
Great, thank you, thank you, Will. I see that we have 5 minutes left, so maybe we can do 1 or 2 more questions, and then we can close up with some final remarks from the panel members. Let's see, Nick or Will, maybe you have a question here on the screen that you would like to react on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to pick the one, if I may, just because we're in an RTRS meeting point, and therefore, I mean, you've already explained, Jan Joris, that RTRS is working on exactly this, which is to put together. So there's lots of questions on the screen, and they're all many of them are all about the same thing, which is, yeah, but how do we get away from what Will has just exactly said? You know, we're taking averages, country averages. You know, we don't have that transparency. We don't have that transparency over deforestation and conversion free. And so those schemes or companies that have that, do have that data, you know, from our point of view, you know, the way to get that into GFLI, or to get the way to get that used by the feed industry is to get it into GFLI, and you've already explained the process by which that is being done. So, you know, we at the moment we are compromising, absolutely, as Will just said. So the more granular we can get the information into the GFLI database, the better. And I would hope that then provides a market pull. So once you do start calculating, once Will and, you know, once the retailers start asking for that information, then that should provide the incentive, you know, for users to be looking at where those, you know, where those products are coming from, and where the CO2 footprint is lower than in other areas, and that's how the market should work.
Yep, indeed. And related to this question, indeed, of course, we are taking GFLI into account also in the RTRS project. Probably somewhere this year, GFLI will open up the branded dataset pilot program. So then it will be possible for companies to bring in their branded data. So this is really something I think to keep in mind also for other producers. And it would be really interesting also for other producers, I think, to take part of such a project with the GFLI. Yeah.
I think one point, because this has come up on a couple ones here, just in terms of the cutoff dates and the years of reference in this 20-year period, which is really important. So the 20-year period, for those of you who aren't in our little technical circles on these conversations, relates to requiring the assessment of impacts looking back 20 years. So if you want to say that no conversion has taken place, then no conversion can have taken place over a 20-year period from your reference point. And you get this sliding scale of impact reduction for each year since that point of conversion or deforestation. Now, as pointed out here, the RTRS standard doesn't go back 20 years. So if you're looking at just using RTRS for that, you're saying, well, actually, if it was properly zero deforestation, unless you have that farm level data, you can't make the claim until 2028 or so of having it be beneficial for that. So this is a point that I alluded to earlier about some people are saying, well, maybe just look at 5 years, which is something we saw come out in the UK around that, because you have to pick your battles. And if the focus is on stopping deforestation, you know, demonstrate that there's an impact or benefit of it sooner rather than going back over the 20-year period where the data may not exist. But that's still controversial and new. So I think that it is important to say that, yeah, this is one of those key elements of credibility. And for the people who raised this 20-year period, clearly it's a conversation you've already had, and Jan Juris is, you know, Rise Smile and Nick are also very familiar with this point as well. But it is a significant issue because we can't ignore conversion that's taken place from a scientific point of view and saying that there is a connection to it. But there is the business benefit and communication side of things, which if you're trying to say that something is better now than it would have been otherwise, how can you communicate that? And that's where there is it's just not there right now in terms of having consistent credibility around what those claims will look like. But it is a significant issue, and the 20-year span it does have a purpose in that, and it's just looking to see if you're going to change things, how do you do so in a responsible way.
Yeah, thank you, Will, for the clarification and explanation. That's indeed really important. We are close, it's closing time, so maybe we can have one final remark from Nick and Will about, yeah, maybe you could say something about, we've discussed several topics, but maybe what would you say is the top challenge and top opportunity regarding environmental footprinting for the upcoming years? Nick, can we start with you?
Yeah, I'll be quick. The challenge is to make sure that we all use the same methodology and data set so that we avoid greenwashing. And my opportunity on behalf of the feed industry and the livestock industry is that environmental footprints will lead more to a more evidence-based discussion on the role of livestock production in sustainable food systems, and not one that's driven by emotion and ideology.
Thank you, Nick. And Will, how would you close off, please?
Yeah, I think that transparency would be the word I'd put forward again. I think that the issue is significant. We are losing large swaths of land. The Amazon is a source of emissions now. This is not something that is to be denigrated or minimized as a challenge. We do need it in context of how much soy production is being responsibly produced today and isn't on land where there's conversion. We need to bring in other elements and look at it well-rounded, where it's not just climate because of pesticide use and other elements that have a significant human and environmental cost associated with them. But you can't deal with any of those things if we don't have that context element of how big is the problem really. And for company-specific claims, I think there is a point of having a degree of caution in terms of how wild you are with what how you're communicating your strategy without ignoring it from it. So we do need it integrated, but we need it integrated in a transparent way that's reflective of actual practice.
Thank you, Will, and thank you, Nick and Will, both for the interesting discussions we had. I really liked it. I think we have discussed some really relevant topics, talking about environmental footprinting and about developments that are going on and that will happen in the upcoming years. So thank you for that. And then I will close off this session and give it back to you, James.
Jan Juris, Will, Nick, thank you so much for a fantastic session. It seems we're now expected to work as if it's live TV. I think you did a brilliant job in taking questions and giving us some really good insights into, I think, this emerging theme, increasingly emerging theme of environmental footprints that's so important to the work that a lot of people are doing here. So just a reminder then of where we're at in today's agenda for the RTRS meeting point. We've had 2 panels already. And we did say that we'd now give you an opportunity to do some networking. So if we were live, if we were actually meeting face to face, this would be where the 250 people in this room would go out into a coffee break, you'd have a coffee, and you'd actually start meeting some of the other people in the room. And we want to recreate that on Zoom. Okay, so what I really encourage you to do is actively participate now. There aren't right or wrong answers. It's just an opportunity for you to meet others who are grappling with some of the similar questions that you are. Please do turn on your video now as well when you go into breakouts. So we're going to have 15 minutes of breakouts in groups of 5 or 6 that are going to be chosen completely at random. And in that space, we wanted to put to you a couple of questions, okay? So the first one is, in your room, introduce yourself and share one insight with other colleagues that you've had from this session and one question. So one insight and one question that you've had from what you've heard so far today. If you've joined towards the end of the session, maybe you don't have an insight or a question, but listen to some of the others that people have put to you. Again, I think the questions are really what lead us to explore things collectively. So share those questions and share those insights. Once you've done that, then choose one of those 5 or 6 questions that have come out and say, okay, let's go a little bit deeper into this one question and spend maybe 5 or 10 minutes discussing that one question that someone's brought to you as well. We do have simultaneous translation in the plenary. We're not going to have it in the breakout rooms, obviously. People will have different language abilities. I would say that 80 or 90% of the people in this space speak good enough English to be able to communicate. There may be a small number of people that need some support, but there are also lots of people that speak more than one language. So if you're one of those people and you recognize that someone in the room needs some support in translation, please help that to happen as well. We've got 15 minutes for that. You will be sent automatically into your breakout room, turn on your video, introduce yourself, one insight, one question, deeper into that question. After 15 minutes, you'll automatically come back into the plenary room as well, okay? You'll see a message on the screen that'll say in 30 seconds, we'll bring you back. No need to do anything. After 30 seconds, you'll come straight back into this plenary. But do just enjoy the next 15 minutes or so, meeting people, exploring those questions, exploring those insights before we come back to our final panel. So Anna, if you'd like to send people into their breakout rooms, and we'll see you back here just before 1:30. Anna, can you give us a countdown and let us know when we're going to be going live again?
Be closing the rooms now.
Okay.
So in 30 seconds they will be back.
Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome back to the RTRS Meeting Point 2021 for the very last of our 3 panel sessions. I hope you've had some really good discussions in those breakouts. It's really good to see people's faces coming back into the main room, and obviously you've met old faces, new faces, explored insights, explored questions as well. Feel free to just use chat now as well if there's anything that came up. If you've got further questions, if you've got insights, do use chat now just to share them with the broader group as well, so we continue to strengthen this community of actors working on sustainable and responsible soy. So just a reminder of where we're at in today's agenda then. We've just completed the networking session. We've had 2 fantastic panels, one on China and one on environmental footprinting. And we're going to go straight on to a session on European legislation. Will it be a game changer for responsible sourcing? Housekeeping messages, a reminder again. First is obviously that we do have simultaneous translation available. This entire session will now be in English. If you'd like to listen to the session in Portuguese, Spanish, or Chinese, click on the interpretation bar at the bottom of the page and choose your language of preference and stay in that throughout. And a reminder that we are able to put questions to our panelists using Slido. Anna, if you could post the link to Slido again there. Panelists, do keep a tab on that as you'll see the questions coming in, and we'll be able to explore questions together. So I'm delighted to now introduce the moderator of the next session. The session is, will European legislation be a game changer for responsible sourcing? And I'd like to introduce Fabiola Zerbini, who is Latin America Regional Director at the Tropical Forest Alliance. And Fabiola will introduce our other speakers. Welcome, Fabiola.
Hello, James. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me well?
Hear you loud and clear.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon for everybody. It's a pleasure and it's an honor now to be part of such important event, important meeting. So thank you, the RTRS team, for the invitation. And thanks also for count on me, to bring and to moderate such great panelists as Mr. Hugo Maria Schkelly and Karen Kreder. In a topic that is very important and very actual for us here who works in a producer country like Brazil. I'm based in Brazil on the soy and how to really have the new legislations in Europe, not only national level, but also in the level of the unit, European unit, how much it will impact the soy production in Brazil and how much the Europe now again could be a player that will impact other trade relations between the producer countries like Brazil, and not only Brazil, here in Latin America, we are seeing a huge increase on the production in countries like Argentina and others, how also this will impact the producer countries, but also in relation with other countries like China. Have we had a great opportunity also to see here now on a panel we specifically focus on this topic. So first, let's use the panel to understand a little bit more what's going on in Europe at this time in terms of legislations. We do have some national, as I told, due diligence being launched or also being implemented, but the Green Deal in the European Union as well, and see how much this can interact positively with the voluntary schemes that the companies are already engaged individually or sectorially, or also the certification schemes, like the RTRS for the soy production, as we all know here. So I'm glad first to introduce Mr. Hugo Maria Schkelly. So he's the head of unit of multilateral environmental cooperation for the European Commission, and also Karen Kreder to join us, the executive director. It's my pleasure now to see you again, Mr. Karen, here of IZEO, to bring us this topic. I think just before, Europe is a very important importer of soy from Brazil and from Latin America, but not only for the quantity. If you look to the percentage, you will see that China is pretty much more important in terms of the amount. But if you look to the importance of the companies, the European companies and the European countries, and really bring voluntary and also mandatory signals, both from markets and from countries, the importance of Europe as a game changer has been crucial since we started all these discussions around sustainability. And now what we are seeing is how to really connect this, the public policies also on the supply chains like cattle and soy. And what we will have now, it's an opportunity to listen from Mr. Hugo Maria Schkelly from your own perspective, from the European Union perspective. How will the existing, but the new ones, legislations will change the sustainability in the soy value chain? How do you see this, Mr. Hugo? Please, you have 3 minutes, and then we will be back in another opportunity to listen to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabiola, and good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening to wherever, depending on wherever you are. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon, and I think that 3 minutes are certainly very short to talk about this subject, but let's put it just in perspective that in 2019, we put out that communication, which actually set out steps that we wanted to take in Europe from the EU side to help tackling the challenge of deforestation and forest degradation globally. And there are 5 priorities in this action plan that was annexed to this communication. Priority 1 was on minimizing the footprint of consumption within the EU. Priority 2 was to work in partnership with producing countries to actually help the shift to a sustainable agricultural practices. Priority 3, work in multilateral and plurilateral context. Priority 4, to look at finance and investment. Priority 5, to look at data and observation. Now, I think today what we are discussing is the work that we hope to do on priority 1, which basically is something that is in the overall context of the implementation of the European Green Deal, which addresses like putting our own house in order to make sure that consumption in the EU doesn't actually contribute to further deforestation and forest degradation worldwide. And I think that in our view, we have over the last years had a very intense interaction with stakeholders from business, from civil society and others. We have had this giant open public consultation, which was the second largest in the history of the EU, with over 1.2 million respondents that were looking at what the EU should do. The results of the studies we've undertaken, the result of the interaction with stakeholders, including from business, and the results of discussing with European institutions was very clear. As much as everybody values the voluntary approaches that we've seen over the last decades, those are not enough. And there was overwhelming support for creating a level playing field by establishing some horizontal mandatory requirements that all suppliers would have to take when going to the European market, to actually take the issue of sustainability out of the competitive area. So they say, well, everybody has to do the same. You should not be able to compete on the basis of being unsustainable. You should be able to compete on quality, you should be able to compete on price, but not on the price that you can generate because you're not observing the principles of sustainability. And in that sense, we hope to put some due diligence obligations on suppliers. Those, I think, who have already taken the commitment to look after the transparency and the sustainability of their supply chain should have little difficulties to comply with that. Those who have been making quite a good living out of being in the shade will find it more difficult. And I think that's only fair. Now, I was really listening with great interest to the preceding session on PEF, because that's something that I've been working on in my previous position. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from that. There is some things that we can take from there for the future legislation. But on the other hand, we actually have to put more emphasis on the need to provide primary data, to actually be clear on your own supply chain, and to make sure that you know where your commodity comes from. And I think that in my understanding, there is a great willingness in the industry in going that direction. I'm quite confident that by that we can not only clean up supply chains, but also can create economic opportunities for those who actually make the right move in the right direction, and to position Europe as a destination for high quality commodities, high quality in a sense that they're also sustainable, and actually to create those opportunities for partners in third countries who want to do that. So I think that's really the objective that we have. And I take the opportunity to be here as a good indication that we have this dialogue, which we can continue as we move along in the legislative process. Thank you very much. I hope I have been faithful to the 3 minutes.
Thank you so much. No, it's so important to listen. 3 minutes. I fully agree that it's not enough. You brought this complementarity, between the voluntary and the mandatory, and Karen, who has leading, an organization pretty much focused in leverage the quality, of the sustainability mechanisms as certification and others, on the voluntary side. So, Karen, how do you see this new legislation, both on national and also in the European level? How much it will change the supply chain, trade relations, production, and consumption? Thank you. 3 minutes, please.
Great. Thank you, Fabiola, and I'm really pleased to be here. So thank you for the invitation, RTRS. I was interested in hearing Mr. Chalet, because there's some words there that I was going to use exactly the same words, like level playing field. So we really welcome the EU's effort to raise the bar on sustainable production. We see that both standard systems, ISO more broadly, groups like RTRS have been public about this support. And we think that the EU's agenda on deforestation, corporate due diligence could have the potential to be a game changer And it would create that legal obligation and that level playing field. And that's very much what we see is needed in order to reach scale and mainstream sustainability. So it's not enough to just have the leaders really taking sustainability forward, but we need that, there are those that haven't seen the business case. So the legal approach can provide that push then for the rest of the market that hasn't been going forward with sustainable practices. So we're very supportive of taking the legal approach. We also think that a smart mix of policies and tools is needed to address the complex sustainability issues. So we don't think that a single policy instrument or a single actor or approach is going to be able to address the complex global challenges of deforestation on their own or in all contexts. So looking at how sort of due diligence regulation can create a strong enabling conditions in Europe, but that through a smart mix of measures, we can bring in governments, companies, NGOs, multi-stakeholder standards to be part of the mix of approaches, so a combined approach. We think it's important for regulators to build on the voluntary approaches that have multi-stakeholder buy-in in their sectors, and that actually government policies can be stronger by leveraging these tools and the tools themselves. So standard systems, if you in this case, can be stronger as well by having the base of legislation to build on. This was noted in the China panel as well. It was interesting to hear the panelists talk about the need for both regulation and then the industry associations that are creating industry or sector specific standards. And I would say that we're quite aligned with that as well. So we think that, when you look at due diligence, that having voluntary standards doesn't eliminate the need for companies to still be part of, to be responsible for their own supply chains, but that standards can provide a framework for producers and suppliers of the supply chain. They can provide capacity building and market linkages, and they can provide information in the supply chain, as been noted in all of the panels, really. So if we look at chain of custody, GHG measuring, there's data that can be provided through the voluntary approaches that can be useful. So I'm at time. I have some more things to say about the holistic approach to sustainability, but I think we will have in the next round, we will have some opportunities there.
Thank you so much, Karen, both perfect on time. I think now, beyond the Union Europe or the European countries in relation with their own supply countries, or even the companies who has a headquarters in one of these countries, but we know that this both market and the political signal of the new legislation in Europe has a huge potential to impact other relations all around the world, on the soil, both from the producer countries to the consumer countries, but also in the national markets. I think pretty much more now, considering the coronavirus social and economical crisis, that had in some way changed, we still do not know, but changed a lot the way that we make traded global relations. So, Mr. Hugo, please, in your perspective, how do you see these new legislations, or even the ones that are already in place, are impacting the global trade relations around, specifically on soy, or even in a broader perspective in the value supply chains? How do you see this, please?
Well, I mean, the main problem about the future is that it is uncertain. So I think we always make assumptions, right? So every impact assessment that we undertake, we take certain parameters as a basis for an assumption. And that sort of is the uncertainty that we're discussing here. Now, the assumption, or the fact is that from our perspective, we are looking at impacting the rate of deforestation and forest degradation for the future. In line with commitments that governments and stakeholders have taken. And I just want to refer to the commitment that we have both in the SDGs and in the New York Declaration of Forests to halt deforestation, forest degradation by 2020. So I think that we do assume that for a large part, what is under cultivation right now, it will be possible for that trade to continue because that is something that we recognize. Those are choices that governments have made, and those are, I think, within the parameters of what you could say of an international consensus. Now, from 2020 onwards, I think we're looking at it in a different way. And I say, okay, what is happening? What are the continuing trends? What are the continuing market signals that influence the future deforestation, forest degradation? I think that is an important element of the discussion. Secondly, and I can only agree with Karen that that's part of the picture. The work with consumer markets other than Europe, the work with producer countries is going to be essential. And that is what we're going to do. And we have worked and we are working in the context of initiatives such as G7, G20. We're engaging with partner countries bilaterally, say, okay, how can we actually accompany that shift to a better agricultural practice? Now, I think that we need other consumer countries that go in the same direction. We would see how China would actually react to the change in that regard, which is, of course, very important. But nothing will deter us from doing what we think is right for the EU market. But one thing that we're trying to also prove is it can be done, and it can be done without interruption of supply, and it can be done without sort of consumers or producers suffering unduly. Of course, there will be changes and there will be impacts. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing it. But I think there will be changes and impacts in the right direction and providing the right market signals. And I think that is what we're trying to do. Now, what I think is very important is what we're doing will not have an impact directly on the investment and finance sector, which is a very important driver in agricultural expansion. And I think that through other instruments that exist or are being implemented in the EU, we are trying to have, at least from the EU investment sector, a clear impact. And I just wanted to make a reference to the taxonomy regulation and its categorization of what is a green and sustainable investment or not. And there will be developments later in the year. So I think it's not only what we are working on with regard to deforestation. There is taxonomy, there's the non-financial reporting directive as revised. There is an initiative on horizontal due diligence for larger companies. So I think it's a whole framework, but together with ideas for forest partnerships and partnerships with third countries and the outreach to other consumer markets. So it's a broad-based approach. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hugo. Karen, how do you see this question? We know that mostly also on soy sector, the companies had put it in place, not only the RTRS certified or even who puts preference to buy from the certified producers, but also sectorial and also individual commitments. As Mr. Hugo just said, the 2020 zero deforestation commitment. So this is not new, at all for the companies or for the soy supply chain. But how do you see the new legislation impacting beyond Europe, or the relations between European countries and the producer countries? How do you see this in a global perspective?
Sure. Well, I mean, Europe is really leading the way with this legislation. So, and we see increasing interest around the world in the question from governments on the question of sustainability and the SDGs. How do governments contribute to the SDGs? So I think that this will really be a game changer, not just for Europe, but then for influencing how policy is developed around the world. So we really think it's a model that others will look towards to see how has it been done, what has been the effect, influence, and likely to serve to be a blueprint for others. So I think that's another important eventual multiplier opportunity or effect that the policies will have. we completely agree in terms of questions around engaging other large markets, China, India, the US, critical on the consumption side. And as we heard from China as well on the production and consumption side, right? So in some countries are doing both, the US as well, producing soy. So the engaging the other places, we heard in the last panel, we don't want to see the good production all coming to Europe and the bad production going someplace else. So how to make sure that there isn't that leakage, and that we're not just shifting where the unsustainable production goes to. I think it's also just important to mention the need for a holistic approach. So this question of making sure that small and medium-sized producers aren't excluded from the supply chains by creating policies that might exclude them, by not having capacity building approaches to enable them to be more sustainable and to link them to the markets. And then also I think the look at deforestation, not purely from a conservation perspective or an environmental perspective, but recognizing that deforestation often comes from a question of livelihoods or economic conditions. And so looking at legislation in a way that doesn't have a narrow single issue focus, but that encompasses these broader issues that producers around the world are facing. Yeah, a couple of thoughts there on that front.
Thank you so much. I think we know now that complex problems demand complex solutions now, and this is what we are talking about here. Let me see. We do have now 15 minutes for a Q&A now between the participants and you both. We have one question, and I think Karen, you could be the one who answered this first one. And so what role should certification scheme now in helping companies to demonstrate compliance, to also be responsible for what will be required by the legislation? So how both can also work together from a company perspective?
Thanks. Yeah, it's a really, really good question, and something that we're studying ourselves. We see that standards and certification were developed as tools to support businesses. Now we're increasingly having government needs as well. And so we're really trying to understand what sort of evolution and innovation and changes are needed in the standard systems in order to now respond to a new set of supportive needs. And I mean, even the greenhouse gas calculations that RTRS is starting with is one example of that sort of innovation and evolution. So we are really eager to hear actually from the Commission and from others creating the legislation about what needs there are for the standard systems and how they evolve. But I would certainly, and I noted earlier that having standards doesn't remove the need for companies to have responsibility for their due diligence obligations. But we do think that there are ways that standard systems can support, and this is around supporting producers to have more sustainable practices, if it's capacity building or other information provision, if it's the information in the supply chain. So chain of custody is certainly an area where many of the standard systems have been strong and are continuing to strengthen. The standards are increasingly seeing themselves as data-driven data providers. So looking to see how that can evolve as the due diligence needs evolve, I think are a couple of the ways that standard systems can engage.
Thanks, Karen. And I just follow on this topic now with Hugo. How much the EU Commission is considering the current certification systems, talking here about soy, the RTRS certification, as an element of the regulation designing process or thinking process. Now, how much connected also in a more official way, both the new legislations and the certification and all the actions that the companies normally does to really follow and accomplish with the certification rules on this topic, specifically on the deforestation, how much it will be connected, Hugo, please.
Hugo, you're on mute.
Sorry, the most heard sentence of the last 15 months, you're on mute. Yes, I know, I apologize. I said, thank you very much. And I profit from the opportunity also to comment on the second question, which is on screen, namely the use that we are going to make of the ongoing study on certification schemes that we have undertaken. And I think that clearly it is a way of answering the first question as well. I mean, the study will come to fruition at the same time as we finalize our impact assessment. So whatever comes out of that study will flow into the proposal, and the experiences from that will actually be considered. Now, the short answer is we don't see a formal role for voluntary certification schemes in the sense that we foresee any type of recognition per se, but certainly voluntary certification schemes can help companies gather the information that they need to comply with the requirements that will be established under the regulation. And I think it's going to be very easy. If you're a certification scheme, can you give your client the information that the client needs to comply with the scheme? Yes, if you can do that in a reliable way, then there will be a use for that certification scheme. If it doesn't, then it will actually not provide added value to the customer in complying with legislation, which actually will enumerate in a fairly precise way, at least that's how we're setting up, what is the information that somebody who wants to place something on the EU market will have to have, and what he needs in order to assess the risk of a specific commodity, in your case, soy, being associated to deforestation and forest degradation in a given area. I think that would be my my reflection on this question. If you allow me, I could, just for the sake of time, also address the third question on screen. That's can I?
Please, I was exactly asked you to do that, please.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So I mean, we have a number of work streams in the Commission, some more general, some more specific, and I'm working personally more on the very specific one, which is on deforestation and forest degradation. But I think there will be a very useful interplay between that, or the initiative, and the initiative that is under the responsibility of Commissioner Reinders and colleagues in DG Just. Only to the fact that there are certain differences in terms of the legal basis. There are differences in the legal structure. So I think they may not come to fruition at the same time, in my understanding. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ugo. I'm going to, one question here is the fourth that it's appearing now in our, and I'm back to Karen. Do you think, Karen, based on your experience with other commodities, now we are here, the question is about the palm oil, but the point, how much do you see that what we are talking here about, specifically about soy, how much we can learn from other supply chains, mostly like the one mentioned here on the question on the palm oil? Do you think that we do have some lessons learned from other supply chains that we could apply to the discussions that we are having here? How much and how can we better combine these legislations and the certification or other voluntary due diligence schemes to really address what Mr. Hugo just brought, to really impact in the rate of deforestation, what's in the end of the day the goal that all of us are committed with. Can you bring other examples from other sectors? Could be the palm oil, but even other to illustrate and to help us on this discussion.
Sure. I mean, certainly there have been there are increasingly approaches where standards are being incorporated into the legislation, and that might be through a benchmarking process. And you could certainly look at the EU Red is one example where it was existing standards were recognized. as a way of building on what the sector has already started with. That is one way that that standards have been incorporated. I think the biggest question in many cases is the biggest consuming countries, you know, are they engaged in sustainability, and are they engaged in the questions around deforestation? And to what extent will the largest, if we're talking soy, to what extent will the largest economies, the largest markets for that production be part of the solution? And so that we're not just transitioning it to another part of the world. And this is where I think, you know, building the concepts of sustainability in all of these markets, you know, I mean, great that we just had a panel on China, that's critical, and that we continue to embrace those markets. Other than that, you know, probably lots of other pieces. I think that the comment here again, that one solution isn't going to solve it all. And so finding a way to embrace the many different approaches that exist and that have positive results. You know, greater supply chain transparency and chain of custody is another topic that was mentioned earlier. And this is certainly something that, you know, transparency is critical. How do you track your chain of custody? That also was mentioned earlier, and we think that could contribute as well.
Thank you, Karen. I'm going here to the second question that is appearing. So certification have failed to stop deforestation. I think this is not the case, no, but here bringing again how to combine. And you mentioned the importance of first, a strong partnership with producer countries and also consumer countries. And how do you see this this public-private piece? So how to really combine, and if you have an example of how it can be implemented in a way that we really have a more meaningful and concrete impact and decrease the rate of deforestation all around the world. So it's not an issue to say that certification has failed, but and not only the law or the legislations will solve everything, but if you can tell us an example of a public-private partnership or even an agreement that you are leading from an European Union with a producer country or a consumer country to really address it in a more combined way.
That's a tough one. I think that I would agree with the comment to say that we cannot lay the blame on failing to stop deforestation or certification. Also to begin with, because certification is just a tool. And it really is something that companies, stakeholders can use, can misuse, can abuse. So I think it's really a question of how you rightly frame this. I think that from our perspective, and I think I would like to go back to what I said, certification has to deliver information to the customer. And that customer, however, retains his full responsibility with regard to reaching a certain objective. Now, I think that from our perspective, we are banking on the one hand on the political will of producer countries to do it right and to make the transition to sustainable food systems. And this year is particularly interesting in that regard because we have the UN Food Systems Summit. And I think there are a lot of interesting ideas in the different action streams. Secondly, I think we have witnessed that in the business sector, there is a high disponibility to actually move in the right direction. I'll give you an example where I was in a panel discussion recently where I was together with two panelists who represented retailers, which I think are not in the end the first one to think of in terms of the responsibility for undertaking due diligence. And they were referring to the fact that they felt sort of that they were well prepared in terms of the due diligence and transparency systems that they had already established. So I think in that sense, using certification system and establishing voluntary transparency systems has prepared stakeholders to confront the challenge of having to do this in a mandatory way. And I think that this will help as we go along to make this easier. Now, I think for producer countries, and I think that's what we are discussing with the many colleagues from there, it's clearly an opportunity. It's clearly an opportunity to get into this kind of green partnership. And I think what the EU is trying to do with those in the context of the European Green Deal is actually to establish forest partnerships. But then there are more tools to that. There's what we call green partnerships. And for those countries that want to go even further, there is the possibility of a green alliance. So I think there are things that we can do in a structured way, but it takes two to tango. So basically there are partner countries or third countries that are willing and interested. There are others that are a little bit more interested, more difficult for the time being. And I think there we obviously have a challenge, and we see whether there we cannot work better with businesses, with stakeholders. There are many countries where this is actually easier than with the government. So I think we have to have a flexible approach in that regard.
Thank you so much. I fully agree. It's not easy at all, but this is what is happening now, and it will happen more and more now. And I think maybe bringing a wrap up, we have only 1 minute to the end of the panel. It's incredible how time, when we are having this kind of good discussions now goes. First, I think this complementarity, was really important in the panel. The mandatory due diligence, will be a reality soon. From at least from Europe, but potentially from other consumer countries. And it will have for sure an impact on the voluntary schemes. But what we are seeing here is exactly a positive impact. So how we can really leverage the voluntary by having these strong legislations in place and vice versa. How the voluntary systems can guarantee the implementation of these new legislations and with quality, and transparency, as Karen just brought to us. So I think that the green partnerships is something that will be more and more key, not only between countries, but also between the mood stakeholders, the actors and the governments, producers and the consumer governments. And this is something that we will together collectively build to really impact, in the end of the day, the rate of deforestation related with soy consumption, soy production, and soy trade relations. So thank you so much, Karen. Thank you so much, Hugo, and all the RTRS organizers for this opportunity. And back into you, James.
Fabiola, Ugo Maria, Karen, thank you so much for your time and for your insights for a fantastic session. I think I leave certainly with that phrase that Karen used, which is one solution isn't going to solve it all. I think what was really interesting from that final session was the point about the interplay between legislation and standards, and how legislation itself can drive up standards from the bottom upwards. And of course, inspire other destination regions such as China. So it's really interesting to draw links between what you guys have shared here now and the beginning of today's meeting point, when we talked about China, which I think as a destination region feels as though it's earlier on in this journey. See standards as a critical part of that journey. What do they look like? What's the role of government? And potentially, of course, I think the experience of Europe being an inspiration for some of the standards and some of the legislation that's going to come out of China in years to come. And of course, in the middle of this session, we had a really good panel as well on European legislation, on environmental footprints. How do you make environmental footprints fair? How do you make them future-proof? And how do you make them future-proof as an approach to footprint that goes, I suppose, beyond just carbon and land use and takes into consideration other variables as well. So thanks to our moderators, thanks to our three fantastic sets of panelists as well. And a reminder that we did have that interlude in the beginning of this journey as well. We follow the journey of the soybean. Many of you are familiar with that journey, but I think it's important to reconnect the people with natural resources, with the technology that surrounds this incredible global supply chain as well. So that was a really interesting piece of today. And we had a networking opportunity as well. So a reminder that we learn by thinking collectively. We solve complex issues by thinking collectively and listening, and the networking opportunity provided that space to do that as well. So we're coming to the final close then of the first block of today, and a reminder that we'll finish now at 1:15 the hour. I'm going to hand over shortly to Marcelo Visconti, but we'll finish at 1:15 the hour. RTRS members themselves will then be invited back into the room, and I'll explain shortly how that's going to work. We did want to just ask you to give some feedback on today's session as well. So we're going to post the survey here into chat. Please just spend 2 minutes giving us your feedback. What worked? What could we work on from this session today? It's again in Slido. It'll take you 2 minutes. We'd really appreciate your responses to that closing survey as well. After we close this room, we're going to go to a different room for the members only session of RTRS, okay? You should all, those of you who are RTRS members and have signed up for the session that starts at 1:30 the hour, you should have received an email, you should register and log in, and you'll receive another Zoom link to be able to join the session that starts at 1:30 the hour. If for any reason you haven't received that, please reach out to my colleague, Agostina. Agostina, if you could just put your email here into chat, send her a quick email. She'll make sure you've got the link to join the next session. That is for RTRS members only. Okay, so if you're not an RTRS member, you won't be joining that session. But if you are and haven't received the link, please do reach out to Agostina. So to close this first session of today's meeting point, let me hand over to Marcelo Visconti, the Executive Director of the Roundtable on Responsible Soy Association. Marcelo.
Thank you, James. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on the place of the world in where you are today. It's a pleasure to meet you all at this RTRS 2021 meeting point. The first and most important thing that I would like to say is thank you. Thank you to almost the 300 participants that we have today. Participants from the whole value chain, from the civil society, industry, trade and finance, from the production, government, academia, from 20 countries all over the world. Without you, this meeting has not been possible to achieve. Secondly, a special recognition to the government officials who have accepted to be with us today. Representation from China, Professor Zhang Yanping, Mr. Zhao Yang, and Mr. Liu Dengao, and from the European Commission, Mr. Hugo Maria Schali. Thank you very much for your participation. To better understand the role governments will play shaping regulatory frames will be of crucial importance for the ones committed to implement and to achieve better sustainability practices. Connected with this, the role of certification that could play within the smart mix of potential solutions was also highlighted by Karin from ISIL Association and also very well explained by Hugo Maria Schali. Thirdly, the journey towards a better transparent measurement of the impacts that the environmental footprinting have for all the chain, including the consumer, was discussed. And the journey RTRS is taking together with the key partners was explained. Last but not least, thank you to our very good moderators. So as a final reflection, I was thinking that I would like to recognize, and I know that you will share with me, that the topic that we were discussing today is complex. From the technical point of view, we are speaking about biodiversity, climate change, how that both interact within a pandemic situation with health global issue. So I would like to propose you all to celebrate the possibility that we have to be here today to debate, to dialogue, to collaborate, and afterwards to implement, building on the inputs that we have received from all the ones that are participating. Within RTRS, we don't believe in a silver bullet. If everyone pulls their weight, I am sure that we will achieve the objective that we all want. Last but not least, thank you to the organizers. Thank you to Olaf, to all the RTRS Secretariat team for this excellent preparation and meeting. Stay tuned for the next RTRS Meeting Point, and thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye, Marcelo. Goodbye, everybody. If you want to turn your cameras and say goodbye, RTRS members will see you back at 1:30. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Good day.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hey guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, translators. We're going to have to close the room now, so we're going to move on to the next room. But